Alright guys, welcome to Formula 1 news. The next time that F1 cars hit the track will be for practice in Melbourne for the Australian Grand Prix, the opening round of the season. But of the top four teams, the two that will be happiest this weekend, no doubt, should be McLaren and Mercedes. The other two teams, Ferrari and Red Bull, they certainly have a lot to work on. Ferrari are making that clear as well, but Red Bull are the ones that have been most vocal over the last 24 hours or so that their car is not really where they wanted it to be. Max says that as far as he's concerned, he doesn't think they're going to be the fastest, and that isn't where Red Bull expect to start the season. Do Red Bull and Ferrari have a higher development ceiling with the new changes that they have made, or is McLaren and maybe even Mercedes going to be the teams to really fight for this year's World Championship? Verstappen doesn't seem especially happy, Hamilton does, but Leclerc is more reserved about the potential of that SF25. Lots to get into today. Very much on Twitter your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I greatly appreciate it. A couple of quick updates from testing. Thanks all for all the new subs over the last few days as well. These were the fastest lap times of the weekends. The fastest of the final day was actually only the fourth fastest lap time of the weekends. It was those Hamilton-Leclerc laps that were arguably the most impressive. Look, Williams' lap time from Sainz was absolutely very impressive, but they made it quite clear that fuel loads and engine modes were leaning in their favour, shall we say. But still, the fact that Sainz tops the test again for the second year in a row is pretty mega. In a Williams, no less this time. And Williams, will discuss them in a second, where they potentially sit in the rankings of teams, because they're either 5th or 6th, depending on who you ask, coming out of this test. Now, it's testing. Last year, Red Bull had a dominant machine at testing. Did they win the Constructors? No, but they were dominant at the start of the season. So you've got to keep that in mind today, that what we are discussing in terms of rankings is relevant now and relevant today, and will be relevant for Australia, although a very different circuit with different characteristics than what is required at Bahrain. By the time we get to round 9, round 10, round 15, the pecking order, of course, could well be very different. So that's worth keeping in mind, the potential development ceiling of some of these cars. But it doesn't take away from how they performed on track this most recent weekend. Now, you guys may have seen yesterday when Max stuck his middle finger up at somebody at Williams. We're not really sure who. Turns out it was his mate. And apparently, he's good friends with this guy, Luke Browning, and he stuck his middle finger up at him. Rumour has it he's not going to face any punishment for this. Thank the Lord, I guess. So we'll see if this actually goes anywhere further, but thankfully no further action for Max for now. But I will say that Max is going to get fined this year. There's no doubt about it, that if the FIA go the way that they're going to go, it seems that Max is going to be in trouble at some point or another. Whether he gets points deductions and championship suspensions and all this, doubtful to me. But even if he does, maybe he's not in the title fight anyway, which is what we'll discuss in a second. Quickly, before we get to the testing for this year, next year's testing has been talked about. It's likely to be in Bahrain again, because it's where they like to test, but also they like to test in Barcelona. And for 2026, Barcelona's not going to be on the track, we think, because it's going to be Madrid. But it seems they're going to add another pre-season testing in late January in Barcelona, which is potentially going to be behind closed doors. Then they're going to go to Bahrain like normal, which is great as far as I'm concerned, because it's more content to talk about, and it's probably going to be great for the teams and the drivers as well. So that's a rumour as to what they're planning for next year. But let's talk about where the teams currently rank. From back to front, we'll do, and we'll discuss what different people are saying, because the perspectives of who you ask is very different. The consensus is McLaren have the strongest car. The race runs pretty much proved that on both days. Their single lap pace wasn't, they didn't show anything spectacular, but the way that that car performs, the degradation that they were able to show, the consistency, the step they've made does seem to be substantial. Right now, McLaren are the team to beat, no doubt about that. And the team to lose to, or whatever you want to say for the team that are worst, is Sauber. Because those guys, it's not looking good, unfortunately, for Bortoleto and Hulkenberg. That car was a bit of a handful, doesn't really seem to have much downforce, just kind of slow. So Sauber are 10th, and McLaren are the best. Whoever you ask, that is what you'll come up with. Now, 9th place is contentious. I think it might be Racing Bulls. Some people might tell you Haas, although there is a perspective that actually Haas are a bit better than they seemed. Their car seems consistent enough, it's just they didn't really do much performance running. I would, have Haas about 7th or 8th, maybe, something in that ballpark. The 9th best team is either Racing Bulls or Aston Martin, as bad as that is. As bad as it could be for Red Bull and Ferrari and the teams we're going to discuss today, at least you're not Aston, right? Because there was even this I saw, according to certain reporters, Albert Fabrega, Antonio Lobato, among others, Aston are either the 7th, 8th, or the 9th best team right now, which is incredibly ugly. Rumour has it that Fernando Alonso is not very happy. Neither is Lance Stroll, Lance Stroll and Lawrence Stroll, about the development they've made over the winter. Doesn't seem like that team has really fixed the issues despite changing a lot about the car. So Adrian Newey has got his work cut out. That is very clear at Aston Martin. Whatever happens this season, then it's potentially Haas. The other teams that are in the fight for the top of the midfield are Alpine and Williams. I did say, you guys, like before the test, that watch out for Williams, right? Because their car last year was better than I thought it would be, given the terrible winter they had when they were moving everything from Excel onto an actual proper competent software. This year, they don't have to deal with that. And they've got Sainz and Albon, which is definitely an advantage as far as I'm concerned. And Williams came out and had a really good test. Obviously, as I said at the start of the video, was Sainz's lap the most impressive of the weekend? Kind of tough to say because you don't know fuel loads, engine modes, and all that stuff, but it was still very impressive. And Albon was quick as well on the final day of the test in addition. So the Williams is a solid car. It seems very impressive, and I honestly, if I had to predict the championship standings right now, would have Williams 5th, because I think that, you know, the Alpine situation with Gasly and Doohan, and then maybe Gasly and Colapinto, like, you know, I think that Williams have the stronger lineup. It's possible that Alpine right now, they have the 5th fastest car. So that's where it is from 5th to 1st. The reason why I'm bringing up this screenshot here is because Craig Slater and Ted Kravitz, they disagreed 2nd through 4th, depending on who they had spoken to. And it's a big matter for debate. Kravitz said he thinks it's Mercedes and Ferrari tied for 2nd. Nobody can split those two, really. Their long run pace, their single lap pace, very, very similar. Different strengths and weaknesses. The Ferrari has great traction and it has good straight end speed. The Mercedes is better into the corners. It does have a bit of a tendency to lock up, it seems, into turn 10. Russell and Antonelli both suffered with that. It is generally better through the mid-speed and the higher speed and has less understeer than the Ferrari seems to have. The Red Bull, nobody really knows. The Red Bull is the real enigma right now, because Max was pretty impressive in the Red Bull, but as we're going to see in a second, they were struggling at Red Bull in this test to really understand what to do and where to go with their car, and it's not responding in the way that they want it to respond. So it may be quick, and they've definitely made a step, the Red Bull, from where they were last year. But I think there's concerns there about correlation that we'll discuss again in a second, and the actual outright performance of the car. I think the risk for Red Bull is that even if they are 2nd, I think they are worried about the correlation and whether they, again, fully understand what they're doing to the car and what that's going to do to their performance. Because if they don't understand that, developing properly is going to be a challenge compared to their rivals. So they could be 2nd, they could be 3rd, they could be 4th. That's where Red Bull currently sits. But interestingly enough, Craig Slater, the people that he'd spoken to with the GPS data and looking at the numbers, he had Mercedes as the 2nd fastest car. And from what I watched, I would tend to agree. I saw the race did their rankings as well. They had Mercedes at 2nd. So as I say, depending who you ask, you're going to get a different answer. But Thomas Maher says as well, from what he spoke to, McLaren have the car to beat. Then it's Red Bull and Mercedes immediately behind that. There's discussions about Ferrari. We'll get to them more in a second after we discuss the Red Bull stuff. But Ferrari have gone with a different direction with their suspension. I think it was maybe somewhat inevitable that they would have a lot to learn. I mean, they've made a massive change to their suspension geometry in the final year of the regulations. They believe it's going to give them a higher ceiling, but right now, Ferrari are not the quickest car and they have issues to solve. Leclerc and Vasseur have been very clear on that. Hamilton, though, is much happier with this year's car, the Ferrari, than the recent Mercedes. No doubt. Hamilton's a much happier man, and I think he is very satisfied with the way that this Ferrari performs. But fundamentally, it's not as fast as the other cars, certainly the McLaren right now. There is a feeling, though, that this is how it is now. In a few months, it may be a very different story. But yeah, rumour has it that Ferrari are going to be beefing Alpine and Williams for 4th, as in Hamilton versus Sainz, Leclerc versus Sainz could be back on, right, for the upcoming season, which would be quite the storyline, really. This is what Amos, they put together the following: McLaren, Red Bull, Ferrari, Mercedes, Alpine, Williams, Haas, Aston, RB Sauber. That's their list. It differs depending on who you ask. They've got Red Bull second. I've not seen that many places. And this is one of the reasons why. So Red Bull, on the first day, they were pretty satisfied. Their car looks like the same as last year, but they've tweaked ever so slightly many of the elements of it. Verstappen seemed very happy. Day one, he said, yeah, the car is good. It pretty much does what I want it to do. The issue, again, Red Bull last year, the car was quick. When they could get the car in the right window, the car was quick. The problem with last year's Red Bull was getting it there consistently enough. Red Bull had real issues extracting the performance from the Red Bull in the middle towards the end of last season. And I think they were hoping that their car this year would be just more consistent in terms of extracting that performance. Again, they didn't seem to make that happen, right? The testing, especially the final day, was a real nightmare on that front. Okay, Ferrari and Hamilton didn't get a race run in because of a hydraulic problem we'll get to here in a second, and that was not ideal. But Red Bull didn't get a race run in because they simply could not find a setup that they were happy to run. They kept sending Max out on various things, and it never really worked. And even a couple of hours before the end of the test, the Red Bull was using FlowViz to try and understand, their issues. Not really a great sign. So for Red Bull, they brought a new front wing and a modified floor to the final day of the testing, and that's not their full upgrade that they have planned for Melbourne, but it is part of it. The wing was fine, that worked, but the floor didn't, apparently. It brought back a nervous behavior in the car, and it was replaced by the older one later in the day. So that's pretty interesting, right? That Red Bull had a modified floor, like an upgrade they tried to bring in. It just didn't really work. And at the end of last year, there was lots of talk from Red Bull that their correlation wasn't where they wanted it to be. They're testing their wind tunnel, which is ancient, right? It's Cold War relic they keep talking about. But fair enough, when you're getting to the business end of the regulations, that may be making a difference. And Red Bull getting the full understanding of exactly what, was going wrong and what it would do to their car and what it actually did to their car, that has caused some concern, I imagine, for Verstappen. Even their technical director said the following: the test didn't go as smoothly as we expected and not as the team hoped, but it's better to find problems here than later in the season. That's exactly why we are here, to understand the car better. The weather wasn't on our side. It wasn't really representative of the circuit. We tried to explore the potential and understand how it responds to setups. We largely achieved that, but yeah, I'm not as happy as I could be because the car didn't always respond the way that we wanted. The direction we're going in is good, but the progress is maybe not as big as we expected. That's something we need to work on for the first race and further development. Now, this is interesting. Now, this guy usually does keep it real, Pierre Vacher, but nonetheless, he's not saying the progress isn't as big as we hoped, which, wouldn't be great, but it would be fine, I guess. He's saying something slightly different, that the progress isn't as big as they expected. Of course, you hope for a certain thing, but you expect something else based on their testing and performance and CFD and simulations and wind tunnel, but they didn't quite get that result, which, of course, throws a spanner in the works in terms of whether they are, again, suffering with actually executing and correlation problems and diagnosing their issues properly. And of course, Newey is no longer there to help with that. So look, it's interesting. Red Bull seemingly have a solid enough car, but there are issues there. And Max makes that very clear as well. There's a rumour that Red Bull are not considering themselves the favourites for the start of the season. They're not expecting to win Australia. But look, if Red Bull go to Australia and they podium, let's say Max is P3 in Australia, that's a perfectly good start to the season. If they can figure their issues, they can make progress. I think it would be unwise to ever count Max out of a championship, right? Like, until I see Max mathematically lose the championship, I'm still going to have some belief that he's going to be able to win it, right? Just because he's won it for the last few years and he's looked so ruthless and dominant at times doing so, that I think writing him off is a mistake. But it's not like Red Bull or Max are especially happy. As Max says, we're trying to improve. Hopefully heading to Melbourne, we'll learn a bit more. Then we'll see where we're at. I don't expect us to be the fastest at all. At the same time, it's difficult to tell where the pace is. So, look, many of the analyses when they do the power rankings of the cars, they might put the Red Bull at fourth, but a Verstappen-driven Red Bull, that might be second. So, because it's so tight in that mix, that's the discussion as late. Now, depending on who you ask, you get a different answer. Dr. Obbs, who knows people internally at Red Bull, he says, no need for panic. The update package was not fully deployed. The rest is coming for round one. No real cause for concern. But, I know that Red Bull fans will hear this and say it's not looking necessarily excellent. Ferrari, though, in many respects, they may be in a similar position to Red Bull. But of course, they talk about it in a different way because it's Ferrari, right? So everything is all, super positive and it's all going to be fine. It may not. We'll see that in a second. This is, of course, a bit concerning, right? So the reason why we are confident that Norris was on the same tyre with more fuel in these runs, which were similar in pace, but obviously very impressive on 30 kilos extra fuel because, that should be 7-8 of a lap kind of numbers in terms of extra kilos. The reason why we're confident is because this was Leclerc's final stint and this was Norris's second last stint. So we're pretty sure that Norris had about 30 kilos extra fuel for this run. And if you look at the average lap times, Norris was about 0.2 down. And he should have maybe 8-9 in hand in terms of fuel load. So, yeah, that's obviously a cause for concern for Ferrari. But does that necessarily mean GG, championship over? Absolutely not. But look, if you look at all of these publications, they've not all of these come up with their own rankings fully from 1st to 10th, but the discussion is unanimous that McLaren have the fastest car. Does it mean that these are going to be the results of the season? Absolutely not. It comes down to driver execution. It comes down to strategy. I actually think if the Mercedes is as good as has been discussed, Russell has a decent chance. Like, genuinely, I think he has a decent chance this year. But we've got to talk Ferrari as well, because Hamilton was trying to get some race simulations in. That never happens. Apparently they called it off because of an anomaly in the data. Rumour has it there was a hydraulic problem that they were concerned about. So yeah, they had to just call it a day, basically, on the test that he did. But these were some of the quotes, really, from Leclerc. And, the balance needs work. We'll give it everything. The car has to be there. Time will tell. These tracks are a little atypical. So, look, it's early days. But Leclerc is of the belief that there is work to do on the Ferrari. Even Horner made the comment today that of the front-running teams, the Merc, the Red Bull, the McLaren, it's the Ferrari in terms of design philosophy and the steps they've taken that's a bit of an outlier. And look, that could be a good thing in 4 months. That's the thing, right? The progression that Ferrari have in terms of development could be massive compared to where Red Bull and the other teams potentially are. But right now, they are behind. There's no doubt about it. Vasseur says, we've opened a new door for development. So far, it's working well. We can make a lot of guesses. We've got to focus on ourselves. The numbers we detected are the same as we expected. So that, I guess, is a positive, right? Because it doesn't seem like Ferrari are panicking. There are rumours that they're certainly having questions as to exactly what they need to do next. But Red Bull are saying that the numbers they detect are not what they expected. Ferrari are saying that they are, even if they're not great, I guess, is the point. But, the feeling still is that they do have more development ceiling than is currently being seen. And the other belief is that Ferrari are committing more resources to the development of this year's car than basically any other team is. So, it's not like, the season's over, McLaren and Lando are going to win the championship by a mile. Obviously, Piastri might put up a fight, but I'd certainly, look, Norris is the favourites, no doubt. As I said, I'm never going to count Max out. The team that I'm really watching, though, is Mercedes, because they are in a really interesting position. They topped the lap times in terms of, topped the lap times on the final day, and they topped the number of laps as well. Their car seems very consistent. Russell was doing some good runs. There's a belief that Mercedes now have a solid platform they can build on, and they're only maybe a couple of tenths off the McLaren. And if that's true, maybe Russell and Antonelli are able to execute. I think it's a fascinating start to the season. But yeah, the rankings are different depending on who you ask. The only common denominator is that McLaren have the strongest machine going to Melbourne. The other thing, just to quickly note on that, Melbourne is a very different circuit, more front limited. Having a pointy front ends is very good and very useful in Melbourne. That is typically strengths of the McLaren, right? That's the interesting thing. McLaren have the fastest machine around Bahrain, as we understand, and that's a rear limited track where McLaren historically haven't been as good. The more front limited circuits, McLaren should be stronger, but the same could be said for the other teams as well. The reality is we're only going to know the answers to these questions in Q3 in Australia, and frankly, when the checkered flag drops in the race as well. So very much intrigued to your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.